Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, amen.
Thank you, everyone. The first talk we had was about whether or not we can understand or know why or how is it that we believe who wrote the Bible. And we talked about, the authenticity of the authorship. The second talk that we had was about the accuracy of the transmission of the text. And this week, we're kind of going into the actual core of the series, which is assuming so-and-so wrote it and assuming that what they wrote was consistent and hasn't been corrupted over time. What leads us to actually believe in it? And so I did kind of very briefly go over, the arguments for why we believe in authenticity. This is what we'll cover today, hopefully. I will recap the early dating of the books. We'll talk about the oral tradition. We'll talk about the internal evidence. And we'll go over these. I'm not going to list them all out now, but we'll talk about them. And then maybe if we have time today, we'll talk about the external evidence. Okay? So don't worry, I'll cover them all. So the early dating of the books, I showed this at the very beginning of the presentation, but this is just to give you an idea of the time frame of when these books were written. So whenever there was an approximation, so for example, like Matthew right here, was dated between 80 to 90, so I put it in the middle. Kind of the same thing with Ephesians and Hebrew and Luke. But notice not all the dates are always, there's no unanimous decision on dating in the scholarship. So like here's another example where people think 2 Peter and these pastoral epistles were actually much later because there was this prejudiced idea that there's no way that the church would have been that organized earlier on. And so they date them much later. But for the most part, the Gospels are around this time frame, and the Pauline epistles are much earlier. Okay, so that's the general dating. We'll talk about oral tradition. And the reason why we want to talk about oral tradition is because there is this idea that people like to kind of discredit oral tradition and liken it to this game of telephone, right? And if you haven't played telephone, this picture here kind of gives you an idea, right? So they say that, the message was passed down, and then, as it gets passed down over the ages, it becomes corrupt. And what ends up being heard by the last person is very different from what was messaged originally, right? And so obviously this is not really a good accurate representation of the oral tradition, because there's this idea that it's assumed by many critics that oral tradition it's very difficult to measure the accuracy of oral tradition. That's the argument some people make, right? And it's assumed by critics that the individuals play little role in the origination and transmission of what gets passed on. And it's very easy for it to get convoluted, right? And so we want to go over and kind of make a good claim for oral tradition. We'll talk about that. First off, oral tradition was actually more reliable than written documents. And a lot of that is because, documents could be forged. And obviously people living around that time trusted a living source. And I mentioned Papias, who was the very first reference we mention, the very first early father that was around the time of the disciples themselves and the apostles. And this is what he has to say. He says this: "And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any of the other Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving source, right? So it's obviously much better to hear it from the person's mouth, especially if they were still living. And so, and especially if there is a short line of succession among the apostles, right? Oral teaching was transmitted openly. So unlike the game of telephone, right, where you're trying to whisper it really quietly so that nobody else hears, the preaching of Christ was very open. It was in the markets. St. Paul went out in the open and was trying to bring in believers. And this was actually something that they wanted to spread the message. It wasn't something that they were trying to hide. And it was handed down many times. It wasn't one time. You know, in that game of telephone, when you play the game, you're only allowed to say it one time to the person. Sometimes we break the rules and we say it again, or we try to whisper it again. But in the case of the oral tradition and teaching of the church, this is something that's passed down so many times and throughout the generations, right? And till this day, we hear many, many sermons. Sometimes we've heard like 1,000 sermons on the topic of gossip. You know, it's not something that we hide or try to hide, unlike the Gnostic teaching, which says that there is this secret super knowledge that only the elect get to hear, and that's what saves them. Okay, what else? So it was corroborated by many witnesses, right? Like, obviously, if I say that this is what happened, you know, and people around that time frame, they read it and they say, well, that's not what happened, you know. It was open to scrutiny, it was open to corroboration, right? So memory retention was much stronger back then than it is now. And it's as I said, you know, the young Jewish boys had to know the Torah very, very well. Greek boys had to know the Odyssey and the Iliad, right? Oh, one other thing. This is something that was a part of the canons of the council, the Second Council of Nicaea. It says that candidates for bishops must know the entire book of Psalms, like the entire book of Psalms, right? There's like 151 Psalms, and 119 is actually a really, really long Psalm. So again, that memory retention was just much more stronger and expected back then. So the main points of what was recorded or what was passed down orally, which we see in the written transmission, we find that, you know, there may be slight variations here or there, but there's no contradictions. There's no one saying that Christ didn't rise from the dead. You know, they're all pretty much pointing to the same thing. Another thing was false allegations would have resulted in tremendous outcry, right? But there's no sense of disagreement, but in fact endorsement of what's going on. You know, why would they preach Christ is risen, and you're telling me no, he's not? You know, I know where he is. He's buried over there, right? Obviously, nobody said anything like that. There were no writings that were, to our knowledge, there's nothing out there that's actually refuting it. There are a few, but they're different. They're not about the fact that he didn't rise. They're just saying that, you know, you stole his body, right? So people were alive to witness these things, and they could have fact-checked it. And the church constantly monitored and intervened when mistakes were made. And, you know, for example, you know, we know the Judaizers who were trying to pass off this teaching that you had to be circumcised you had to pretty much become Jewish before you can become Christian. And the church obviously nipped that in the bud. All right, I have a diagram here showing the oral tradition hierarchy. And this is a very crude diagram because it doesn't show you it doesn't do justice, right? Like, look, I could make 12 lines here, 500 lines. But it just shows you that it's all, you know, it's not one person that's passing it down and then another person and then another person. It's many people receiving that tradition, right? Which helps us, right? Because in the same way that we know that the transmission of the actual text is accurate, the same thing we can say about the oral tradition or the teaching of the church. You know, when you go back to the apostolic churches, you find that the oral teaching is the same, you know, among the apostolic Orthodox churches. It's all the same. right? That's why when you go to a Greek church, or a Syrian church or an Indian Orthodox church, you find that they're pretty much preaching the same thing, So now we'll start talking about the internal evidence, right? And the very first thing we'll talk about is the cultural context. Obviously, if something was written, we would expect it to have characteristics of it being written at that time, right? And so what are those characteristics, right? The very first thing is, these Aramaic words, according to one biblical scholar, his F.F. Bruce, he says that Aramaic is known to have been the common language of Palestine, especially Galilee, in the time of Christ, and was probably the language in which he and his apostles habitually spoke. If you look at the New Testament now, you'll find that there are many words that are untranslated, or not untranslated, but they left in the original Aramaic word. Why would they do that? Why would anybody do that, right? And we find examples of this, and I put the references here, and then the Aramaic word in the middle, and then the English translation, right? Why would they keep this in there? What would be the purpose of that? I can't understand why anybody would, but we do have remnants of that culture, that time frame, that the language that was still didn't, go away, right? In the same way, you look at Arabic, you look at Egyptian Arabic, and when we say fruit, we say what? We say uta. Uta is a Coptic word. It's kind of stuck, and it just stayed there. In the same way, the Aramaic kind of stuck, and it kind of stayed there in the biblical text, okay? We have Jewish expressions, very Jewish expressions, right? Like we have something like poor in spirit, right? Jesus refers, this is kind of in reference to Isaiah, right? In Isaiah, it says, on him who is poor and of a contrite heart or contrite spirit and who trembles at my word. And the Hebrew word here for poor is anai, meaning not only poor, but also humble and lowly. So it's to be humble and lowly, okay? So this is a Jewish idiom, okay? We have another one, eye of a needle. So this is an expression, a Jewish expression that is found in several places like the Talmud. The Talmud is like a Jewish text. And they have a verse in the Talmud that says, who can make an elephant pass through the eye of a needle? Okay? So again, this is a very Jewish saying. Here's another one. The use of heaven as a euphemism for God. In Matthew's gospel, in St. Matthew's gospel, he would rarely say God, because to Jews, God's name was too holy to be uttered. And he would use heaven. He would say kingdom of heaven. And that's why his nickname sometimes is the scribe of the kingdom of heaven. It's because God's name is too sacred. You can't write God. You can't even fully spell out Yahweh. You have to write YWH. It can't be written. It's too sacred. And so the use of heaven as a euphemism for God, this is something mainly in the Gospel of Matthew. Cut it off and pluck it out. This is in reference to sin, right? If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your arm causes you to sin, cut it off, right? This is a Jewish expression, right? What it means is if you have a habit of stealing, stop it, right? So if you have a habit of envying, stop it. These idioms have been in general use throughout the centuries, right? And they arise from the fact that Aramaic collapses into one word, both mental and physical action. So with it either meaning both, either or both meanings, whether it being physical or mental. And that explains why no Christian in the East has ever cut off his arm because of this verse, with the exception of maybe one or two people. But they misinterpreted what it meant, right? It means to stop it, to cut it off, right? And again, it could be taken in both ways. The eyes of your heart. This is a good one. It's an expression referring to understanding or knowledge, right? What is the eye of your heart? This is the knowledge, right? Not to be confused, right, with like slow of heart to believe, okay? The word heart in Aramaic often means mind, right? So to have a heavy heart means to have a sluggish mind. It doesn't mean to be sad. It doesn't mean that you're down or depressed. It just means he's sluggish. He's slow. The dude is slow. He's not getting it, okay? Son of peace. The Aramaic word is bar shalema, which literally means son of peace. But if you translate it, it actually means harmony or agreement, right? So it's the opposite of contention. The Greek literally translates son of peace, but this is, again, it's not exactly, sometimes when you translate word for word, you lose the meaning, right? So that's, the meaning is he's in agreement. Pressed in spirit. Okay, this translator did not translate the phrase idiomatically. It actually means he felt he was not free to speak, like he was prevented from speaking. Okay, who shall declare his generation? It pretty much means his line was cut off. In other words, he has no living relatives or descendants, and the context of the passage is taken from similar to Isaiah. I don't want to go too much into that, but we'll go to the next one. His face was set. To set one's face means to make up one's mind. It's a frequent Semitic expression, and it's found all throughout the Old Testament. Here's an interesting one, the bowels of Jesus. So in Byzantine versions, they say bowels, but in the Alexandrian texts, they tend to say love, right? And it's how you translate the Aramaic idiom, right? This one guy, scholar Paul Yunan, he says, as the heart is viewed as the seat of the intellect, the bowels are the seat of compassion. So it's the compassion, the love of Jesus, okay? Here's another one we're quite familiar with. Hate your father and mother, right? He who does not hate his father and mother cannot be my disciple, right? In the Hebrew scriptures, the contrast between love and hatred is sometimes used to communicate preference. So for example, in polygamous marriages, this wasn't something God wanted, but he allowed at the time, was that if there were two wives, one was beloved and the other was hated, right? There was a loved wife and there was a hated wife. But it doesn't mean he actually hated her. It just means that he preferred this one over that one, like Rachel and Leah. Obviously, Rachel was the loved, preferred wife, and Leah was the less loved wife. So the law isn't actually saying you have to hate your wife, right? It just, it's saying, you know, there's a preference. So sometimes hate is used to indicate preference. Okay. One other thing, the gospel writers display an incredible familiarity with the geography of the regions that are mentioned in the New Testament. If you mentioned, like, there are like 13 what do you call these regions that are called out here, and then a bunch of towns and a couple bodies of water. Okay, so when you compare this list with the false gospels, which we call the Apocrypha, they provide us almost no geographical details. For example, the Gospel of Thomas mentions Judea once and no other location. The Gospel of Judas, another false gospel, doesn't even list a single location. And the Gospel of Philip names only Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Jordan, and that's it. Versus, if you were to look at these gospels, they're very specific in their details, and they're intricate. There's one guy by the name of Simon Greenleaf. He is history's one of the most important legal figures, and was a professor of law at Harvard. And he kind of was instrumental in organizing the university's law program. He wrote a 3-volume work called A Treatise on the Law of Evidence. But he wrote a much more interesting work about the reliability of the Gospels. And in that book, it's called The Testimony of the Evangelist. The Gospels examined by the rules of evidence. So what he does is he compares the data that we have of the New Testament and sees if it's something that it's admissible in court, sees how would the court evaluate the reliability of this text, right? He says something very interesting. He says this, he says, the writers allude, for example, to existing manners and customs and to circumstances of the times of their country with the utmost minuteness of reference. And these references are never formally made, nor with preface and explanation, never multiplied and heaped on each other, nor brought together as though introduced by design, but they are scattered broadcast and singly over every part of the story, and so connect themselves with every incident related as to render the detection of falsehood inevitable. The minuteness, too, is not peculiar to any one of the historians, but is common to them all. Though they wrote at different periods and without mutual concert, they all alike refer incidentally to the same state of affairs and to the same contemporary and collateral circumstances, right? So there's not much disagreement with them at all. In fact, it's very, very cohesive. Here's another interesting thing that one researcher, Dr. Richard Bachman, in his book, which I mentioned before in the first lecture, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he tabulated the frequencies of the names of individuals found in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, and compared them to the frequency of proper names found in Jewish ossuaries, right here. Those are coffins. Those are Jewish coffins. And he found some very, very interesting results based on that data. Likewise, here on the left-hand side, the popularity of names cited in Palestinian literature of the time, and then the popularity of names cited by the New Testament authors. The data is actually quite very interesting, very, very close, right? Just something I thought was very interesting to share. Okay, so I think in general we've talked about the cultural context and the region, the names, the events, and the language, and the cultural expression. Now we'll talk more the reliable, the testimony itself, right? Those who say you can't trust the testimony, some say it's because, oh, they're biased. But the people who say that are themselves biased against trusting the New Testament. So it's reasonable to conclude that we cannot trust any accusation they make against it because they're biased. So the argument forgets that every single writing is biased, regardless, because every writing is written by a human being. And everyone has an opinion and everybody has a message to deliver, but that doesn't mean bias makes you incapable of reporting facts, right? We have unbiased testimonies in the Bible. In John, it mentions that his brothers, Jesus's brothers, did not believe in him. Okay, in Acts it says, Paul was a persecutor of the church. He persecuted the church and wanted to destroy and kill everybody, put him in prison, right? So Simon Greenleaf, the guy I mentioned before, he says that there's several ways you can go about looking at the credibility. The first, you have to look at the honesty of the writing. The second thing is the ability. Their ability, were they in a position that they could write reliable information? The third is their consistency, the consistency of their testimony among each other. The fourth is the conformity. Does it conform with the experience? Fifth is the coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. We'll talk about that last one a little bit because it's quite involved. The very first thing we should probably notice is that the authorship, you would not think of these individuals, maybe except for John over here, you would not pick these people. If you wanted to falsify an account and pass it off as accuracy, you would not pick these people. Why? Luke and Mark are not even part of the 12. They're not even part of the 12. Luke, where did Luke get his information from? He may have been of the apostles. There are two traditions about Luke. He may have been one of the apostles. Others say, no, he was a Greek Gentile. More likely he was a Greek Gentile. But he got his information from Paul, right? Mark, where did Mark? You guys should know this because we talked about where Mark got his information from. He got it from Peter. Remember, Mark was the interpreter of Peter. He wrote down the memoirs or the story from Peter. The gospel was essentially the gospel of Peter, but Mark wrote it down, okay? So they were not direct eyewitnesses to all the events, okay? Why would I pick these names if I wanted to falsify the accounts? It doesn't make any sense. Matthew was formerly a hated tax collector, and he was not even part of the inner circle, right? People did not like Matthew. I'm sure they warmed up to him over time, but he was a tax collector. People hated him, right? Why pick somebody who's not in the, like somebody who had a very notorious background and who wasn't even part of the inner circle? The only person that makes sense is John, right? He's the only one. When you look at the false gospels, though, you see the opposite. They use very prestigious names, big names like James, the Gospel of James, the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Andrew, Thomas. These are part of the 12. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, right? This was something that Gnostic teachers tried to pass off as part of Christianity, and one of the ways they did that to manipulate people was by assigning their gospel, their quote-unquote gospel, with a big name. Somebody, oh, it's Peter. That's much more reliable than Mark, or Thomas, or Bartholomew, right? Anyway, we'll talk about the sincere tone, right? So when we read the Gospels, we find that there is a certain tone that you find. Luca, could you read this?
Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not the lover of money. Let everyone submit to the governor authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. Do not owe anyone anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any other commandment are summed up by this commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law.
So thank you, Luca. So by reading and listening to this, do you get the sense of, somebody who's trying to spread falsehood? Do you get the sense of somebody who lacks integrity? Rhetorical question. We'll move on. There is a very interesting ancient writing found in the 1st century, and this ancient writing was by a physician by the name of Dioscorides. He lived between 40 to 80 AD, and he was a Greek physician and a pharmacologist. And he was regarded as the authority on medicine in ancient times. He ended up writing a volume. And I want to share with you guys the prologue to that volume. Andrew Shecker, could you read this prologue?
Although many reports have been made, not only in the past but also recently, about the production, effects, and testing of medicines, I nevertheless intend to instruct you, dear Arius, about them. The decision to undertake such a thing is neither needless nor injudicious, for some of my predecessors have not completed their works, and others have written most things down from hearsay. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the world, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have.
I'm going to give you guys just a minute or so, not a minute, but look at both of these prologues. It's quite amazing the parallels you see here, right? Luke, by the way, is a physician, just like Dioscorides. But you look at both of their writings here, it's quite amazing, the parallels and the style, the way they are presenting the information, right? Many believe Luke's preface as a whole belongs within the tradition of Greek historiography, right? And is considered pretty reliable. And if you even just read Luke, the quality and the assurance and the style and the way he's writing is very sober, very kind of dry, actually, not very exciting, kind of like a history book. But yes, I just wanted to kind of show you guys these parallels. It's quite interesting. Okay. Some people have claimed that the followers of Jesus did not distinguish between newer sayings and the original words of Jesus. So, for example, someone can try to make the claim that the teachings currently provided in the church by its leaders are the very words of Christ. You know, anybody could say, oh, but these are the words of Christ, you know, but of course everyone will be suspicious of that statement. The teaching of Christ can help us reach a conclusion, but to say that these exact words are the words of Christ may appear to some to be a stretch, right? Skeptics say, well, that's the result. The Gospels blend these two types of material. So we don't know what goes on or what the historical Jesus actually said. So I want to share with you guys this passage. This is Paul. He says, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. If she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. He continues to say, to the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Notice how in the first part he says, this is the Lord saying. Notice also in the second part he says, this is not the Lord, but this is what I'm saying. Pretty honest. I mean, if it were St. Paul, you could have just said, well, the Lord said both. Why complicate the matter? But because of his integrity, because of his honesty, he's willing to say, no, the Lord has not said anything about this. Therefore, I'm going to try to take a stab at it. This is what I say. Right? He could have very easily just said, this is what Jesus says. Right? So that tells us that the followers of Jesus did not try to forge his sayings, and oftentimes convene together in councils to deal with the issues, such as the Judaizers in Acts 15, right? And based on their outcome, based on that settlement and speaking with one another, they're able to handle these issues without trying to say, oh, yeah, no, Jesus already said that. You know, Jesus said Jews, they needed to be circumcised. No, he didn't. He didn't say anything about it. That's why the church had to convene and deal with it. Anybody could have easily dismissed any problem just by saying Jesus said, but that's not what happened. The Gospel of Peter, one of the false Gospels, one of the characteristics of these false Gospels, they're quite ridiculous. This is the account of the resurrection. Okay. Can somebody, Happy, would you mind reading this?
All right. But early when the Sabbath was dawning, a crowd came from Jerusalem and the surrounding area in order that they might see the sealed tomb. But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding in 2 by 2 in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven, and they saw that the heavens were opened, and that 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and come near the sepulchre. But that stone which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off the side, and the sepulchre opened, and both the young men entered. And so those soldiers have seen, awakened by centurion and the elders, for they too were present safeguarding. And while they were relating what they had seen, again they see three males who have come out from the sepulchre, with the two supporting the other one, and a cross following them, and the head of the two reaching unto heaven, but that of the one being led out by a hand by them going beyond the heavens. And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep? And an obeisance was heard from the cross. Yes.
I'm not going to go into detail, but if you were following with this story, it's quite ridiculous. The fact that everybody was guarding the tomb, the fact that three people came out and the two of them were supporting the one. Pretty much one was standing on the shoulders of the two, and his head was reaching up to the heavens, and he was pretty much a gigantic person. And then a voice coming out and saying, have you proclaimed to the fallen asleep? And a cross coming out from the sky. This very overly dramatic, false narrative. And if you look at the Gospel of Mark and how much more plain and dry it is, it's quite a difference. All right, the moral codes. Mark, would you do me a favor and just start reading these off?
Love your enemy, turn the other cheek, be perfect as your brother in heaven. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Hate family or yourself to be a disciple. You're responsible for bringing light. Reconcile with neighbor before prayer. Do not commit adultery with your eyes. Go the second mile to help others. Do not judge others. Deny yourself and take up your cross. Be a servant to others, and the truth shall set you free.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Looking at these moral standards, they're very unique to the tradition of the Jews, right? Because in addition to not murdering, Jesus says, don't even get angry with your brother. In addition to not committing adultery, Jesus says, don't even look at a woman lustfully. Instead of leniency with divorce, Jesus says, unless if your spouse were to commit adultery, they cannot commit sexual immorality by marrying another person. In addition to not swearing falsely, Jesus says not to swear at all. Instead of an eye for an eye, Jesus says not to resist an evil person, but to turn your cheek. Instead of hating your enemy, Jesus says, love your enemy and do good to those who curse you. The moral obligation is way too high in Christianity. If the gospel is putting such an emphasis on doing the right thing and telling the truth, it makes no sense that the authors would intentionally spread falsehood in their message. The very last part here, the truth shall set you free. Peter in his epistle says, whoever would love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from deceitful speech. Paul in Ephesians says, therefore putting away lying, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbor, if we are members of one another. It would make no sense. Christianity is preaching a very high level of morality. It's saying to tell the truth. Why would they tell me to tell the truth if what they're telling me is not true? One of the amazing things of the Gospels is the character of Christ. People talk about Christ and his impeccable character. It's just completely flawless, right? Completely flawless individual. I like this quote by C.S. Lewis. He goes against that patronizing thing that people say who are not Christian, who's like, I'm willing to accept him as a moral teacher, but he's not God. This is what he has to say. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Why are we limited to these choices? Why is it that Jesus cannot say the things that he did and be a great moral teacher? One of the things is Jesus' teaching is so closely tied to his self-understanding of who he is. The fact that he forgives sin, right? C.S. Lewis actually, in the portion right before this quote, he had a very nice thing where he said, we can all understand how a man forgives offenses against himself. You tread on my shoes and I forgive you. You steal my money and I forgive you. But what should we make of a man himself unrobbed and untrodden on, who announced that he forgave you for treading on someone else's shoes and stealing someone else's money? You know, pretty much you're crazy. Yeah, but this is what Jesus did. He told people that their sins were forgiven, and never waiting to consult with other people whom their sins had injured, right? So his sense of who he was very tied to his teaching, right? He taught as if he had the moral authority of a God. So to say he's a great moral teacher, but not God, is nonsense. He would not be a great moral teacher. He would be a manipulator, okay? Eyewitness accounts. Eyewitness accounts. I'm not going to read all of these, but these are just a bunch of verses. The one I will read is the one that it's underlined. The one that says, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So many people had firsthand eyewitness. And in here, it actually says those who are still alive. So people reading this letter can easily go and verify that and check and speak to these people, speak to these individuals. And it's not like he doesn't mention names. He calls out specific names. James, the apostles, he appeared to me, and so on and so forth, right? So we have a lot of attestation. There are no less than 6 early independent sources within the New Testament that corroborate Jesus' resurrection, right? And here's something I want you guys to understand. A lot of people say, okay, but that's in the Bible. You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. But there's something wrong with that statement. We need to shake ourselves from the presupposition that the manuscripts of the New Testament are one document. They're not one document. We cannot write off these manuscripts because hundreds of years later, the church collected them all and put them under one cover and titled it the New Testament. Okay, there is no such thing as the New Testament. They were just independent documents written in Greek, like Paul's letter to Corinth, John's Gospel, Luke's Gospel, the Book of Acts. And they were collected later and they were put together and called the New Testament. But it's very bad historical methodology to say, well, that's in the New Testament, therefore it is not a valuable historical resource, right? What we have to do is we have to treat these documents for what they are originally and apply the criteria of historicity to the documents with the view towards determining what is reliable and what is unreliable, okay? So there are many books, there are many parts. And by the way, it's not just in the New Testament. There are actually other references, and I'll get to that later. There were no ulterior motives, right? They did not seek after the big three. You know, those are the big three reasons why: wealth, power. Obviously, there's no wealth in preaching the gospel. Power, there's no power. There's no such thing as the power of the church. The church is getting persecuted. Sex, I mean, they were all celibate except for a couple who were married, like Peter. And besides, he left his wife. So, and in Peter, you know, he says, we left all and followed you. And Paul, he describes his hardships. The fact that he went through so much, Paul, actually. I would read, there's this passage that's quite unbelievable, that where he describes what he's been through. He says this, he says, 5 times I've received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. Think about that. 5 times I've received 40 lashes, 39 lashes times 5. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, though many a sleepless night, hungry, thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. He also speaks about his financial burden. And he actually gets kind of like passive aggressive with the Corinthians. It's like, I started the church there. Is it not okay for me to ask for any help or assistance? It's kind of ridiculous. So he talks about that financial burden. All the disciples were martyred except for John, and all of them died on the premise of seeing the resurrected Christ. So some people make this argument. It's like, okay, well, Muslims, they die for their faith too, but they're dying not because they saw something. These people saw something. They're dying on the premise of the fact that I saw this dead man rise from the dead. It's different from how my faith, I have to put more trust in it. For them, they didn't have to put as much trust in what they're seeing because it was before their very eyes, right? And the church was actually very strict when it came to making sure that whoever was preaching was an eyewitness. And in fact, Paul was rejected by some of the churches that he founded because he had to argue for the case of the fact that he was an eyewitness, because he wasn't originally part of that group. We have biblical and non-biblical evidence of the martyrdom of the apostles. So just to give you some flavor of that, let's see. Let's see. There are references by, give me 1 second. So the writings of the church fathers, there are several places all throughout the New Testament. But we also have external evidence. The church fathers are considered external. They're not part of the scripture. And a lot of them, I'm not going to go through the list, but even Josephus, the Jewish historian, he's not Christian. He wrote about the death of James, that James was put to death in his book, Jewish Antiquities. He also mentioned the killing of John the Baptist. So there are other references as well. We have a distinct yet coherent testament, right? The New Testament is 27 books in total, 8 different authors over a period of 40 years. But they all are consistent upon these foundational facts. Christ was God. Christ did many miracles. Christ taught to live righteous. He used parables. He fulfilled many prophecies. He was crucified. He rose from the dead. He grants eternal life to his followers. And in general, there is mention of the Holy Trinity's role in our salvation. Okay. So in Simon Greenleaf's book, The Testimony of the Gospels, he says there's enough discrepancy to show that there could have been no previous concert among them or collusion, and at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show that they were independent narrators of the same great transaction, right? Here's a diagram kind of showing you the material found within the Gospels, right? A lot of people believe in Mark being written first. They call it the theory of Mark in priority, and that Luke and Matthew used a lot of the material from Mark, not saying that they copied it, but that the same material, which is a big portion of Mark, is in Luke and Matthew, along with unique stuff to Luke and unique stuff to Matthew. And even Luke and Matthew share some similarities, right? And this is kind of to show you that if the same things happened, you would expect to see, the same material found in all the Gospels. But at the same time, you would scratch your head and say, well, there's no way they're exactly the same. And it shows you that, Luke did have his own unique material, so did Matthew. And, Luke, Matthew and Mark all kind of shared some material, as well as Mark and Luke, right? And so there should be some difference and similarity. The question is, how much that should be. So skeptics, a lot of people say, they will either say, we do not think that these testimonies are truly distinct from each other, right? But they all copied from one another, which compromises the multiple source attestation argument, because they're saying, oh, well, it's the same source, right? Or they say this, they are so distinct that they cannot be reconciled with one another due to the contradictions, and therefore they cannot be reliable. So one is saying they're all one source and they're all the same, so you can't call it multiple source attestation. The other is saying, no, they're so different. In fact, they contradict each other and they're not reliable. How shall somebody respond to these? It's like you say one thing, they go to the other thing. I say, oh no, that we have multiple sources. Oh, well, not really. They're all one source. They're all copied from each other. At the same time, you say, oh well, they're all in agreement. Oh well, not exactly. They contradict each other. You can't have it both ways. This reminds me of when Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, and he said this: "To what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to their companions, saying, 'We played the flute for you, but you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and you say he has a demon. The Son of God came eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children.'" Right? There are those who say, due to contradictions, we can't trust the New Testament. We'll discuss contradictions later, but I just wanted to touch on the fallacy concerning this. If one were to use the same logic, then based on the historical accounts found here, we can conclude that the fire of Rome did not actually happen because there are contradictions in the accounts. But no historian would ever claim that because there are contradictions, they disprove the fact that there was a fire in Rome, right? This actually tells us that the differences in accounts don't disprove it. In actuality, the differences indicate reliability, so long as that they agree on the major foundational storylines, right? Here he says, Nero openly sent men to burn the city of Rome. Nero secretly sent men to burn the city. Nero may not have been responsible at all. Filling the gaps. So, true, reliable eyewitness accounts are never completely parallel and identical. Instead, they are different pieces of the same puzzle, sometimes unintentionally supporting and complementing each other to provide details of what happened. Scholars sometimes call this undesigned coincidences, meaning that they are claims or facts that different books or letters mention, which overlap and confirm other claims made independently, right? So this can refer to accounts that fill in gaps that were left loose by one biblical author. And there are many examples. I'll give you an example. If you're not following, I'll explain. Okay, so Matthew 8:14 says that there was healing in the evening. It mentions that Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and that's the gospel we read today for Egbeah, by the way. But it also mentions that they brought in more people in the evening. Question: why did they wait until evening to bring those who needed healing to Jesus? The answer is found in Mark and Luke. They tied up that loose end, right? They said that it was because of the Sabbath, and you can't work on the Sabbath, and the day lasted until evening. So of course Jesus did not want to draw unnecessary attention to himself, or unnecessary attention to his followers. So they waited until evening to heal them. Another example, the secret transfiguration, when Jesus was transfigured, it states that the disciples told no one. why wouldn't they tell anybody? Mark tells us why. He says that Jesus told them not to tell anyone until he rose from the dead. Matthew 11:21, works and Bethsaida. Jesus says, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have been repented long ago. But we are not told what mighty works were done in that gospel. It is only in Luke, which mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida. Okay? Here's another one. We are told that Herod was speaking about the fame of Jesus with one of his servants, thinking that he was John the Baptist. The question is, how did Matthew know what Herod was talking about in his palace? How could Matthew know that? Luke unintentionally gives us the answer. He states that Joanna, the wife of Chusa, was Herod's household manager. And she obviously was one of the followers of Jesus. Mark says the Jews were accusing Jesus that he would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. However, none of the synoptic gospels say where they got this claim from. It was in John that explains that Jesus said this metaphorically when he was speaking about his resurrection, speaking about the temple of his body. Luke, the Pharisees tell Pilate that Jesus is claiming that he forbids giving tribute to Caesar and that he is the king. After Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king, Jesus confirms his statement. But Pilate then says he finds no fault in him. How does that make any sense? In John, we get the fuller context, in which Jesus tells Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world, so it poses no threat to Caesar. Not only that, Luke is the one who tells us the accusation, but John does not. So Luke gives us the accusation, and John gives us the answer as to why there was no charge against him. This is what I mean by filling in the gaps and providing incidental coincidences. Here's one of the biggest ones, which I never understood until recently. We have the story of the disciples fishing. Can somebody read that?
And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew's brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him.
He said to them, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. How does that make any sense? Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. Why would they immediately leave their nets? Why? That doesn't make any sense. Why would a random stranger come up to you and say, follow me? You drop your net, you leave your business, and you pretty much dedicate your life following him. The answer is found in Luke, who gives us a much more clear answer. He says, then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. But Simon answered, said to him, Master, we've toiled all night, caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to the land, they forsook all and followed him. Now that makes sense, right? Luke gave us the full story. Matthew gave us bare bones. Like he barely even wants to talk about it. And by the way, that's very characteristic of Matthew, because Matthew is not so much the storyteller. Mark and Luke are much more storytellers than Matthew. Matthew cares about the teaching, the verbal teaching of Christ and recording the teaching. That's why most of Jesus's words are found in Matthew. Whereas most of his actions are found in Mark and Luke, right? Matthew, he had to redact or he had to choose what he wanted in his gospel, and he pretty much very skimmed this whole portion. But you see what I'm trying to say is the gospels, they complement each other. They fill in gaps where the gaps are left. And they have this, puzzle piece that brings everything together. Some people are visual like myself. So as a visual, I want to show you guys how the Bible itself is actually very, I guess, one. I don't know how to describe it. This diagram is a reference. You have here on the left side the Old Testament, on the right side the New Testament, and wherever you see a line, that's a line that's being referenced from somewhere in the Bible. So it's quite amazing when you look at the text and you see how this beautiful rainbow, all this linking together. You see the beginning goes to the end, and it's just very beautiful. So for those of you who are visual, anyway, unlikely passages. They're very perplexing passages. The inclusion of very difficult material to understand, which on the surface appears to be contradictory and could potentially be a strong indicator that the author of the Gospels had the integrity to the extent that they were willing to preserve these confusing passages so that they could provide an accurate account, right? For example, Jesus does not know the hour of his coming. Now, let me just say this. We have no problem answering these questions, but for somebody who doesn't know or hasn't been taught properly, this is quite, you probably don't want to mention it because it causes more of a hassle than not. But to the gospel writers, no, they have the integrity to mention it, right? He says he does not know the hour of his coming, but in that very same gospel, he says all things have been handed over to me by my Father. He says Jesus could not do miracles because of the lack of belief. But in that same gospel, Jesus said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. My Father is greater than I. In that same gospel, he said all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? Okay. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And he who sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do the things that please him. He calls Peter Satan. And in that same gospel, he says, I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Jesus does not heal the blind man until rubbing his eyes a second time. But in that same gospel, Jesus raises a dead girl by saying, little girl, I say to you, arise. Jesus can do nothing of himself. However, in that same gospel, he says, therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. Why do you call me good? In the same gospel, he says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. Jesus calls the Father his God. But he also said in the same gospel, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. And in the beginning of that gospel, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Who touched me? That was the woman who touched the hem of his garment. But in that same gospel, it says he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. And he also said, all things have been delivered to me by my Father. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. But in that same gospel, he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And then he calls a Canaanite woman a dog. But then he also says to that same woman, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Now, we have no problem with these passages. No issue in terms of doctrine or teaching. But why would anybody include material that could potentially be used to go against their agenda? You know, even today, some Christians really struggle with these passages. There's some scandalous material. Jesus has 2 prostitutes in his ancestry. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his family. Jesus is thought to be a deceiver. He's deserted by his followers. He's called demon-possessed. He speaks with an adulterous Samaritan woman. That's a double whammy. Actually, triple whammy. She's a woman, she's a Samaritan, and she's an adulteress. Jesus is beaten and mocked brutally by soldiers. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples. Jesus is crucified. Anyone hung on a cross is cursed. Women were the first to discover the resurrection. That's actually a big one, because the testimony of women was close to worthless in ancient times. The disciples were terrified when Jesus appeared to them, and they struggled to believe it was truly him. Some still doubted. By the way, that was left open-ended. Matthew left that open-ended. They still doubted. Some of them. There is much embarrassing material from the disciples. They argue about who's greatest. Peter denies Christ. Some of them ask Jesus to burn the Samaritans. All abandon him during his trial. They don't understand him half the time, and they lack belief in him even after the resurrection. Why would anybody include this material? This would not help your case. That's if I was trying to falsify or Jesus is my God. Why are you painting this picture of Jesus? And why are you making Peter look bad? Why is everybody like implicating themselves here? Why is this information here? We have excessive non-theological verbiage. In other words, some things that you might think are useless. Now I will come to you when I pass through Macedonia, and it may be that I will remain or spend the winter with you. Pretty much information that really it's not really quote unquote important, right? Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Certain women who had been healed out of evil spirits, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom Joanna, Herod's steward, and Susanna, many others. Maybe that one's not as bad, but the last one. And they compelled a certain man, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Who cares? Why do we care? He's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And he was carrying Jesus' cross. Why would anybody mention this? It is unlikely that these passages were made up at a later date, because they would only matter to the specific people that were reading it. The very first people were reading it, right? And the fact that they were included speak to the integrity of the scribes, right? Any scribe could have said, this portion doesn't matter. It doesn't talk about Jesus being the Son of God, the miracles. We could just remove it. They didn't. They kept it in. Even though it could have been seen as wasting unnecessary space, time, and money. Time copying it over and over and over again, and money, because parchment, papyrus, and ink were not cheap items. They were not cheap at all. Criteria of dissimilarity. So this is pretty much saying that Jesus was not plagiarizing Jewish thought and just adding a twist to it. In the same way, he wasn't taking Greek thought and adding a twist to it. Why? Because the concept of the Messiah to the Jews was very different. He would liberate them from the Roman persecution. He would establish an earthly kingdom. He would return the Jews to their homeland. He was not God, by the way. He was anointed by God, right? This is a quote from the book that I have. This is a book, The Trinity Doctrine Error, by a Jewish guy named Gerald Segal. He says, For Jews, son of God referred to one who obeys God. For the Greeks, son of God meant for the same substance. So he's trying to say that, oh, this is a Greek thing. This is a Greek mythology. So the concept of the crucified and resurrected Messiah was completely foreign. Jews believed in resurrection, but only on the last day. Right? And there's this concept of the Trinity. He says that the Trinity is never found in the Jewish or Christian scriptures, right? Pretty much, it's not just a rehash of Jewish thought or theology. It's something that came that was unique. It wasn't something that Jesus copied or plagiarized from somebody. In the same way, some people are making the claim, oh, well, this is just, Neoplatonic thought mixed with Greek mythology and all that. However, so we should look into that. Are there any similarities between Jesus and mythological stories? Because a lot of people say there are. So religion had nothing to do with morals and ethics in the Greek culture, right? Philosophy was the culture of the cultivation of virtue. That's something you find in Platonism, Stoicism, all the isms. Whereas religion had nothing to do with ethics. People were intrigued by Christians because of that, because a lot of them were not educated, but they had that ethic, that idea of this very deep, I guess, thought. Obviously coming from our Christian teaching. They fall into several fallacies, and I'll go over these fallacies, right? I don't want to spend too much time in this, but the first fallacy is called the composite fallacy. And this pretty much says that people of this camp, they lump together pagan religions all together as one religion when making comparisons to Christianity. So they attempt to make and show strong parallels by combining different various religions together. But when you look at the individual myths and stories themselves and you study them, you find that there are major differences, right? So this is the composite fallacy. The second one is terminological. Christian terms are used to describe pagan beliefs. And then it is concluded that there are parallel origins and meanings. But the term that was used are the same, but there are big differences between the Christian and pagan practices and definitions of these terms, right? The third one, chronological fallacy. Some say that Christians borrowed from the ancient Greek mythologies and religions, but long story short, it's the other way around. All the Greek mythology, it was debunked, and they found out it was actually much later. The intentional fallacy. Christianity has a linear view of history. History is moving in a purposeful direction, right? Whereas in the mystery religions, the Greek mystery religions, it's very cyclical, right? History continues in a never-ending cycle and repetition, like in Hinduism, reincarnation, the world restarts or something like that. It's very different. Just the concept in general is very different. I have a lot written about it, but I don't want to waste time on this. I want to go into the external evidence, and I will end at the external evidence. Just bear with me, okay? The extra biblical Christian sources, we have quotations from the Bible by many early church fathers. In fact, this list is very not good because it's very, it leaves out so many other church fathers and a lot of other quotes that are not mentioned. That's why I think this diagram is really cool. This one shows you, so like if you look at the top here, Clement of Rome, 95, Justin Martyr, 100. These are the years that they were. And these are the quotes that they had. So he quoted in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and all these books. And you continue on and you see, keep in mind, it's actually very hard to find these quotes because they're not necessarily verbatim, right? They could have been worded differently. So it's very hard to actually do this kind of research. I'm going to talk about the secular testimony now because I think this is very interesting. Don't worry, I'm not going to go too much longer. So we have several secular historians, non-Christian historians, Tacitus, Lucian, Flavius Josephus, who's probably like the biggest name, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Thales, Phlegon, and Marbar Serapion. And these are their dates of the times, their time frames, and the subject matter. I want to show you some of their quotes, though. I want us to kind of read through their writings. Can I have a volunteer please read this?
Tacitus, 56 to 120 AD. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. The Jews were expelled for making disturbances because of the instigator Christus. They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with their instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property.
This one is, this guy is probably the most well-known of the, because he wrote a lot. Flavius Josephus is a Jewish historian. He wrote this work called The Antiquities of the Jews. He says, at the time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. There are Jewish sources too, although they're very unflattering sources, because obviously they want to discredit Christianity and they want to badmouth Christ. So Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. Rabbi Hizda said that Rabbi Jeremiah bar Abba said, what is that which is written? No evil will befall you, nor shall any plague come near your house. No evil will befall you means that evil dreams and evil thoughts will not tempt you, nor shall any plague come near your house, means that you will not have a son or disciple who burns his food like Jesus of Nazareth. It was taught on the day before the Passover they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days, proclaiming he will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him. But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before Passover. So if we want to summarize these non-Christian sources, we could say that he was called Christ, according to Tacitus Suetonius. He was a Nazarene, according to the Talmud. He practiced magic. He was a king. Serapion says he was a king, a wise king. Josephus says he was only wise. He may have been the Messiah, according to Josephus. He was executed the day before the Passover. Sentenced by Pilate. He was crucified. That was by Lucian who said that. But Tacitus, Serapion only mentioned execution. His followers believe that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, according to Josephus. His followers are called Christians. He was a god who they worshipped and sang hymns, according to Pliny. Lucian says they worshipped him with rites. His followers partook of an ordinary food, communion, Pliny. His followers believed they were immortal. They were deaconesses, and his followers expanded from Judea to Rome. It's quite amazing the story you get from these non-Christian ancient historical sources. Okay? I'm almost done, bear with me. Let's fact check some of the things that are in the Gospels. Historical facts. Luke is the historian, right? He's the most detailed, intricate person to write in the New Testament, right? He's the most educated too, along with Paul. One archaeologist carefully examined Luke's references to 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, finding not a single mistake. Okay? In chapters 13 to 28, there's a list of places by Luke which scholars have accurately corroborated, right? Here's a list. Another interesting thing, Luke's accuracy on the death of Herod Agrippa. This is what Luke says. Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a god and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. Now, if you compare this with Josephus, his writing, which was actually later, this is what Josephus says. He pretty much says, yeah, now when Herod Agrippa had reigned 3 years over Judea, he came to the city, okay. He put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful. So that's exactly what Luke said. He was arrayed in royal apparel, right? And he came in the theater early in the morning, and his flatterers cried out from one place and another, though not for his good, that he was God. That's exactly what Luke said, the voice of a god and not of a man. Upon this, the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. Again, he did not give God the glory. Right? A severe pain arose in his belly, and he began in a most violent manner. When he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life. Okay, and then he just gives the details of when. Here, Luke says he was eaten by worms and died. Does that contradict? Well, not necessarily, right? Luke is a physician, right? And among those physicians who are here, happy, maybe you can fact check me on this, there is a condition called trichinosis, which is a parasitic disease caused by worms that can invade your intestines, resulting in, a lot of bad stuff happening to you, right? And it could take up to 1 week. So Josephus says 5 days approximately, but here it could take up to 1 week, in which the larva can hatch and grow and cause real bad complications, and in some extreme cases it can be fatal, right? This is a very scientific way to approach it, but of course God could have, this is all orchestrated, obviously, but it's just to show you the accuracy of the account, right? Some archaeological findings. Pontius Pilate's stone was discovered. The coffin of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest. The St. James's inscription that he was the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. Luke refers to a king that was found within a certain time frame that corroborates the Gospels. John's detail about the pool of Bethesda, was very, very detailed. Very, very detailed. You have another inscription that was accurate in terms of its time frame. The Nazareth inscription, that one's actually really cool, because the Nazareth inscription was an edict which forbade anybody to steal bodies from the tombs. Why would anybody want to steal a body from a tomb? There were grave robbers, but those people were stealing treasure. They were stealing valuable things. Why would somebody steal a body? Why would somebody write this inscription? Any ideas? Why would somebody say, whoever steals a body from a tomb gets the death penalty? It's because the claim was that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Okay? They stole the body of Jesus. That's the claim. Yes, from the resurrection. All right. The Gallio inscription. This was actually a big discovery because it allows us to date the time that Paul was in Corinth. Because Gallio sent all the Jews away from Rome and back to Corinth. There's another inscription. Abuna Gregory Bichet loves to talk about the Shroud of Turin. He has done this really deep analysis on it. I won't go into it though. This is the last thing I'll show you. These are a bunch of Roman emperors. There's the name, who they are, when did they rule, the New Testament reference. And then there's these last two columns, which I think are really cool. Evidence in historical writings outside the New Testament, and evidence of inscriptions, like on coins and on stones. And so this is just a few, right? There's a bunch, actually includes New Testament stuff too. And so there are governors, there are political figures. Anyway, I'm going to end here. Any questions?
So what was the reason that they would want to steal bodies? I kind of missed that.
Yeah, so the claim that the Jews were saying was that, he didn't rise from the dead. One of his followers came and stole his body from the tomb. Right? And that's what they believed. They believed, they just stole his body from the tomb. And in order to prevent other false stories from coming up, this person resurrected or this person resurrected, they put this inscription saying anybody who steals a body from the tomb will be put to death. It's as if they didn't want to hear another story about a resurrection.
Okay, I see.
When in actuality, this
Mm-hmm.
they were making up this, claim. Some believed, and they had this inscription. Any other questions?
So Tony, earlier in the presentation, you were
Yes.
mentioning that oral tradition is more reliable than documents.
So there's a caveat to that, right? It's more reliable because there was a surviving voice at the time. So to those who were in antiquity, if John and Luke and Mark and Matthew are alive, or the disciples of those people are alive, I would much rather trust it from a source that's trusted, because anybody can forge a document, right?
But
Anybody can
even a live source, they can inflate their exaggerate.
They
right?
can exaggerate, but it's one thing if one person's exaggerating. It's another thing if 5 or 10 people or 500 brethren are telling me the exact same exaggerations. 500 brethren who are surviving witnesses.
Well, you could say the same thing for documents. You could have 500 documents.
You could. That's why when I'm saying it was considered more reliable, I'm saying it was considered more reliable for people who were in Papias's position, because in his position, a lot of those disciples and eyewitnesses were alive. Now, yeah, you could say these eyewitnesses conflated or they embellished, but again, that goes back to their testimony. That goes back into what they were teaching, what they were writing, and how they wrote their teaching, right? If I go to you and somebody tells me, yeah, I saw a miracle. Okay, if it's one person, I'd probably say you're a lunatic, because I'm a skeptic. But if every single person in my congregation tells me they personally saw it and witnessed it with their own eyes, it will be much harder to pass off as false. I'm not saying everybody should believe it in that case, but I'm saying it's much more credible. Keep in mind also that in oral tradition, the concept of the legend growing over time, it's actually not a very good argument, because like I said, the teachings of Christ and the stories and the eyewitness accounts, not only were they mentioned seen by many people, and they were passed down by many people, but that teaching and that oral tradition was very strong and very easy to be retained to people back in those days. People who were memorizing many things. It's easy to remember stories. And then you also have the writings of the fathers of the church who you look at it and it's consistent all throughout the generations. Consistent with the Gospels, consistent with other ancient testimonies and traditions that are even outside of the Christian writings. Keep in mind also that they said miracles were done, miracles were seen, miracles were witnessed. So it's not like the magic trick was done and okay, there, you can never see it again. Okay, so I'm done. Glory be to God forever, amen. Sorry it took long. But next week, we're going to go into more details about what does Scripture mean? Are there contradictions? Are we reading it the right way? Because a lot of the argument about contradictions is because those who read the Scripture are actually not reading it correctly. And we'll talk about what are the common mistakes. First, we'll talk about what is Scripture, what is inspiration, what does that mean, and then how do we read it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you, Tony, so much. And thank you for using the medical term for what they call meiosis. Meiosis means like the small larva or the hatch of the egg of the insect can infest the skin and eat the flesh.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.